I'm always completely shocked when I hear people say how good things were in the USSR, how delicious the ice cream was, and how good the Doktorskaya sausage was. How much did it cost back then? 15 kopecks. But when it comes to the fact that the Soviet government killed millions of people and committed crimes, ice cream lovers say, well, that doesn't count. How can that be? The USSR committed a lot of crimes, and today I'll tell you about just a few of them, both those that were nationwide and some local crimes. You need to know the true face of the USSR. This is a combined episode of previous videos. My name is Semyon, and this is the Mega Show TV channel. Let's get started. Crime number 1. The Great Terror. Today we will look at the events of the Great Terror, which claimed the lives of more than 2 million people. Of those, about 700,000 were executed without trial or investigation. Just think about that number. 99.9% of all these people were innocent of any wrongdoing. Actually, that's not quite right. For the most part, they were guilty only of being educated intellectuals and smart. That alone made them a threat to the criminals sitting in the Kremlin. The USSR and later Russia did everything possible to hide the truth about these events, but the time has come to reveal it. This video will surprise you, shock you, and make you more informed, so watch until the end. An explanation of the historical context before the start of the Great Terror, the Yezhovshchina, the situation in the USSR in the 1930s. Laughter. The Bolsheviks, when they came to power, pursued a very misguided policy, both domestic and foreign. As for foreign policy, it's simple. The USSR found itself almost completely financially blockaded by other, more developed countries. In today's terms, even back then, Russia was under massive sanctions. If someone doesn't know the history, I'll explain why this happened. The Bolsheviks seized power and declared themselves the successors of the Russian Empire. And as is customary, along with the succession, the Tsarist debts also rightfully passed to them, along with the assets, and that was, no more no less, 12.5 billion rubles. To give you an idea of how much that is, the average salary in the Russian Empire in 1917 was 37.5 rubles. Naturally, the communists took all the assets and power for themselves, but they decided not to pay the debts. On January 21, 1918, the Central Executive Committee issued a decree stating that, absolutely and without any restrictions, all foreign loans were annulled. To put it simply, other countries were just cheated out of their money. They didn't like that, and they didn't want to do business with the Bolsheviks anymore. This left them deeply isolated from the rest of the world. And here, by the way, I want to point out that this moment became one of the most important in the modern mindset of Russians. It was from this point in history, essentially, that this image emerged. The West, the enemy and absolute evil. The Soviet authorities couldn't tell the truth, that they cheated everyone, so they launched an all-out propaganda campaign about how bad the West was. How could that be? What right did they have to impose sanctions against such honest Russians? After all, until that moment, the West was not some kind of single common enemy for the Russian Empire. Until then, what happened to Russia was the same as what happened to all other countries. One day they are fighting against each other, and the next day they are allies. The Russian Empire was constantly at war, but there was no such idea that all civilized countries were bad and wanted to harm them. On the contrary, the Russian Empire did everything it could to be part of Europe. Thus, because the Soviet government was dishonest both with other nations and with its own people, it turned out that those who didn't want to think for themselves ended up believing this fable about the evil West. And now their descendants believe it too. But in defense of those who lived 100 years ago, it can be said that it was difficult for them to get any information. And those who live now have free access to almost any information. But everything in the world is connected, and the foreign policy of the USSR had a strong influence on the country's own domestic policy. After all, it's really hard to survive in isolation. The Soviet authorities first announced the so-called New Economic Policy, or NEP. Under this policy, they reduced the tax from 70% to 30%. They allowed market activity and various forms of ownership. People, you could say, got at least a small taste of the civilized world. To put it very simply and clearly, during this period, those who worked and wanted to earn money had the opportunity to do so, and a middle class began to emerge in the USSR. But this didn't last long. The Soviet authorities saw a great threat in the middle class and educated people, a threat of losing their power. As Mikhail Tomsky, the leader of the Soviet trade unions, said, "We have many parties, but unlike abroad, here we have one party in power and the rest are in prison." And the Soviet authorities decided to end the NEP and introduce dekolakization and collectivization. In simple terms, to take away all property from all peasants and make it communal. At the same time, those who had more property were sent into exile or even executed without trial or investigation. So people were first given the opportunity to earn, and then everything was taken away, and for some, even their lives. All this caused great unrest and dissatisfaction in the country. In 1930 alone, there were 13,453 mass peasant protests. This included 176 insurgent actions and 55 open-armed uprisings. In total, almost 2.5 million people participated in them. The highest number of protests occurred in Ukraine, 4,098 in the Volga region, 1,780, and in the North Caucasus, 1,467. The unrest was brutally suppressed and people were subjected to repression. At the same time, almost all the grain and other food supplies were taken away, which caused mass starvation. It's hard to believe, but in Ukraine alone, about 4 million people died from hunger in 1932-1933. In general, to sum up what preceded the Great Terror of 1937-1938, people were starved. All their property was taken away. They were sent into exile and sometimes even executed. The key word here is sometimes, because innocent people were executed, but not that often. Until 1937 came, when the inhumanity of the USSR increased many times over. The Great Terror began. Ход событий. But before 1937, we definitely need to go back to 1934. There were two events that strongly characterize Russia and explain many things. At the end of January and the beginning of February, the 17th Congress of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, took place. It went down in history as the Congress of the Executed. At the Congress, the dictator and murderer Stalin solemnly spoke about unity in the party and claimed that democracy reigned in the USSR. After all, at this Congress there was a secret ballot for the election of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks. A total of 1,059 people voted. And according to the official data from 1934, 1,056 people voted for Stalin. That means 3 people were against him. For a certain Kirov, 1,055 people voted. That means 4 were against him. But these official figures were actually falsified by Stalin himself. This became known only in 1960 from declassified archives. 60-м году. As it turned out, Stalin actually received a huge vote of no confidence. There were 289 votes against him. Apparently, some Bolsheviks already understood back then who Stalin was and how much trouble he would bring. That's why they wanted to remove him and appoint the popular first secretary of the Leningrad Regional Committee, Sergei Kirov, who was well liked by the people. Stalin feared for his power. And what do you think he did? He decided to get rid of everyone who was against him or didn't support him enough. If only this were just a movie. Then you could even admire the level of cunning, slyness, and treachery in Stalin's actions. But this wasn't a movie. These were people's lives. Stalin makes the decision to kill Kirov, and he carries it out on December 1, 1934. Naturally, not with his own hands, but through a hitman. Zinoviev and Kamenev are immediately accused of this. The first had already been Stalin's rival after Lenin's death. And on that same day, December 1, 1934, a law was passed on the procedure for handling cases related to the preparation or commission of terrorist acts. According to this law, investigations into those accused of terrorism must be conducted in an expedited manner, a maximum of 10 days without lawyers and without the possibility of appeal. The sentence was carried out immediately. This law created the legal basis for the escalation of repressions, and it gave the Bolsheviks free rein to eliminate their opponents and adversaries. Here I want to make an important point, a very important one. It must be acknowledged that Russian dictatorial authorities have always been very skillful. Manipulators. They have always covered up their criminal actions with so-called official documents. Here, they themselves killed a person. And they themselves passed a law that now allows them to kill whoever they want. And nothing will happen to them for it. After all, that's the law. Putin is constantly using this now in Ukraine. It's not Russia that attacked, but the people of Donetsk and Luhansk who asked Russia for help, and Russia couldn't refuse them. That's complete nonsense. But people believe in this. Brainwashed Russians. After all, there is a document where they ask for help. And yes, it really does exist. But that document was written by Putin himself. But let's go back to the 1930s. The adoption of this law allowed Stalin to legally kill anyone he didn't like. For example, the 17th Congress is not called the Congress of the Executed for nothing. After all, in the next few years, about 70% of all participants in that democratic union were swept up in the purge. They were simply shot without any kind of trial. The most interesting thing is that even the person who wrote this law was executed. The head of the NKVD, Genrik Yagoda. He was replaced by Nikolai Yezhov. After his appointment, the wave of mass repression began, which went down in history as the Yezhovshchina. And yes, spoiler, Yezhov was also executed later, a couple of years later. The Soviet authorities developed a taste for violent reprisals, and they decided to use these methods not only against political opponents, but also against ordinary people. That's why, on July 30, 1937, NKVD Order number 00447 was issued regarding the operation to repress former kulaks, criminals, and other anti-Soviet elements. In simple terms, the authorities could now execute absolutely anyone under supposedly legal grounds. Unfortunately, I can't tell you the exact number of people who were convicted under this law in 1937-1938 because there is a lot of different data. On average, the numbers range from 1.3 million to 2.5 million people convicted. About 700,000 of them were executed. The rest were sent to prisons or into exile. How were the criminals identified, and who were they? To speed up the review of hundreds, let me repeat, hundreds of thousands of cases, it was ordered to use judicial repressive bodies for this, namely the so-called NKVD and USSR Prosecutors Commission, which included Yezhov himself and the so-called NKVD troikas at the republic and regional levels. For those who still don't understand how the process worked, the authorities would fabricate a case against an innocent person, and instead of a trial and any chance to defend themselves, everything was decided by the troikas, which consisted of the head of the NKVD, the prosecutor, and the secretary of the regional committee. And the decision was always guilty, no matter what the person said. The troikas became the peak of terror, being a direct violation of the USSR constitution of that time. According to Article 102, judicial functions in the USSR were carried out only by the court. The USSR Constitution of 1936 did not provide for any extrajudicial bodies. Nevertheless, the Soviet authorities sent thousands of innocent people across the country to camps and to execution every day. Decisions were made in absentia, based on fabricated case materials provided by the NKVD authorities. Often, this happened simply based on lists of those arrested, without any protocols, and without the possibility to appeal the sentence. On the first page of such cases, 3 rectangles were drawn, in which each member of the Troika would write a number corresponding to his decision, 2 for the camps, 1 for execution. If before the Great Terror, death sentences made up about 1/10 of all verdicts, now every second person faced death. The common phrase "without trial or investigation" fully reflected the bloody essence of that time. For all regions of the Soviet Union, quotas were set for the number of people arrested and convicted under the first category, that is, execution. Initially, across the whole country, it was planned to execute only 70,000 people and send 200,000 to the Gulag. But in Order number 00447, a mechanism for escalating terror was built in. It was stipulated that local leaders had the right to request additional quotas for arrests and executions from Moscow. Everyone understood that this right was actually a party obligation, so the plan was always exceeded in the spirit of socialist construction. Almost the entire population of the Soviet Union, except for the communists, fell under the bloody purge. Among those who saw Stalin not as the leader of all peoples, but as a mustached criminal whose fault brought hunger and NKVD terror to the country, the execution lists were being filled with kulaks, prosperous peasants, those who managed to survive collectivization and protect their farms from being plundered, with the old and new elite, including former Tsarist officials, officers, entrepreneurs, and intellectuals, with national minorities, representatives of peoples considered potentially dangerous to Soviet power, such as Poles, Latvians, Germans, Ukrainians, Jews, and other peoples. On November 30th, 1937, Yezhov personally signed cipher telegram number 49990, which launched the Latvian operation of the NKVD, killing 16,575 people. Clergymen? Here too, unfortunately, it is impossible to provide exact data since different sources give different figures. In total, from 50,000 to 200,000 were repressed, and both Orthodox, Catholic, Islamic, and Jewish clergymen of all denominations and faiths were executed. Hundreds of thousands were executed or sent to camps for no reason. Relatives of those arrested, involuntary witnesses of arrests and executions, people who were convicted on false charges. The repressions were accompanied by large-scale falsification of criminal cases, as a result of which many were convicted for crimes they did not commit. However, almost none of those executed at that time had committed any crimes. The first mass executions took place at the Levashsky firing range near Leningrad on August 2, 1937, and at the Butovsky firing range near Moscow on August 80. In just these two places, 45,000 and 20,000 people were killed, respectively. According to reference data from the USSR Ministry of Internal Affairs in 1953, these numbers are most likely greatly understated. In 1937 and 1938, the NKVD arrested 1,575,259 people. Of these, 1,372,382 were for counter-revolutionary crimes. 1,344,923 people were convicted. It was in 1937 that the use of brutal torture and beatings of detainees became widespread. In addition to the 680,000 people who were executed, about 115,000 died while under investigation. It is also important to note the incredible inhuman cruelty. Those sentenced to the death penalty were not only executed by shooting, but were also subjected to various forms of abuse. For example, in the Vologda NKVD, the executioners, with the knowledge of their decorated chief, decided to behead people with an axe. In the Kuybyshev NKVD, out of almost 2,000 people executed in 1937-1938, about 600 were strangled with ropes. In Barnaul, the condemned were killed with crowbars. In Altai and Novosibirsk regions, women were subjected to sexual violence before being shot. In the Novosibirsk prison, even the staff competed to see who could kill a prisoner with a single blow in pairs. How did the Yezhov terror end? The bloody Stalinist bacchanalia led by Yezhov lasted for almost 2 years. Having destroyed almost the entire elite of the nation, namely priests, politicians, military commanders, engineers, and managers, the USSR found itself on the brink of World War II, facing an intellectual, administrative, and resource catastrophe. Stalin, realizing the possible consequences, quietly got rid of his attack dog Yezhov, replacing him with the more rational and balanced Lavrenti Beria. Yezhov himself fully experienced all the horrors of the bloody killing machine he had created. Lavrenti Beria arrested Yezhov in Malenkov's office on April 10, 1939. Just like the hundreds of thousands of innocent people destroyed by the bloody commissar, Yezhov was accused of preparing a coup d'etat. And 10 months after his arrest, on February 3, 1940, he was sentenced by the military collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR to the ultimate punishment, execution by shooting. The sentence was carried out 3 days later, on February 6th. The mass repressions were abolished. With the start of World War II, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, and then the USSR attacked Poland, the terror began to subside. This no longer happened in the main old territory of the USSR. But then, Terror returned again in the territories that were newly annexed to the USSR as a result of the division of spheres of influence between Germany and the USSR in Eastern Europe. By decision of a special NKVD Troika of the USSR, in accordance with the resolution of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks, dated March 5, 1940. 21,800 people were executed in the Katyn forest and at the NKVD headquarters in the city of Kalinin. 157 Poles prisoners of the Kozelsk, Starobelsk and Ostashkov camps. What do Russians think about this? The Great Terror was a brutal and inhuman non-military crime of the 20th century that brought immeasurable suffering to millions of people. For Ukrainians, Poles, Belarusians, the Baltic peoples, Finns, Germans, and all those who suffered from Stalinist repression and communist ideals, those years will forever remain years of a terrible national tragedy. And only modern Russia still cannot fully decide what the Great Terror really is. Is it a terrible legacy and the pain of the whole country? Or was it a necessity of that time? It seems like pure madness, but according to surveys, more than 60% of citizens in modern Putin's Russia regard Stalin with respect, admiration, or sympathy. And almost half of respondents aged 18 to 24 have never heard of political repression under Stalin's rule. Only 6% of Russians consider the mustached leader a criminal, responsible for the tragedy of many European peoples in the 1930s and 1940s. And 43% believe these repressions were completely justified and necessary, supposedly to maintain order in the country. This only highlights the gap in thinking that separates Russians from the rest. The total infantilism of the Russian nation, its centuries-old dependence on czars, dictators, presidents, reinforced by Kremlin propaganda about external threats, and the need to strengthen dictatorial power and impose order in the country to achieve painful imperial ambitions, has played a cruel joke with the mentality of Russians. The Kremlin authorities have always taken advantage of this unnatural attitude of Russians toward terror, treating it as a necessity. Already after World War II, after the Hungarian uprising, fearing that communists and Chekists would also be hanged from lampposts in the USSR, the Politburo of the CPSU Central Committee, in a closed letter dated December 25, 1956, to the party organizations of the Soviet Union, pointed out the need to address and combat the cult of personality and its consequences, thereby inspiring the launch of yet another repressive campaign. Then Khrushchev became afraid of the possible outcome and the process was stopped. Currently, Putin's government in modern Russia shows no fear. A surge of politically motivated prosecutions has swept the country, and opponents and undesirables are receiving extreme prison sentences. Former enforcers of dictator Putin's will are being eliminated by the authorities. Prigozhin in 2023 has already repeated the fate of Yezhov in 1940. Agent Gherkin is still in prison for now. And this is still just a small-scale terror campaign. The scale isn't the same. Second crime. Soviet military blew up a kindergarten and covered it up. The USSR is known not only for space and nuclear weapons, but also for its secrecy and constant lies. For decades, the USSR kept silent about its numerous mistakes, miscalculations, tragedies, and disasters. And the events that couldn't be kept quiet were twisted by Soviet propaganda in a way that was most beneficial for the ruling regime. Where necessary, they exaggerated. Where necessary, they downplayed. Genuine facts were mixed with outright lies, and this whole mass of information was presented to people as the ultimate truth. Some information about Soviet aviation. Tell me, what do you know about Soviet aircraft manufacturing, about civil and military aviation? Well, just that the USSR had many airplanes from different design bureaus. An, Tu, Il, Yak, Mig, Su, as well as helicopters produced by Mi and Ka. But what do you actually know about the quality of these machines, their reliability and safety? Almost nothing. At that time, the Soviet aviation industry was heavily promoted throughout the country. All citizens were encouraged to use the services of Aeroflot, as if there was any other company. America and the Western world are very weak at manipulating people because the press is diverse. But the USSR and now the Russian Federation blatantly lie, and that's why they can brainwash people so easily. They do everything to make sure people don't think or try to analyze. Ask any fan of the USSR how reliable airplanes were in the USSR and everyone will say that their airplanes were the best of all. And they say this not because they came to this conclusion themselves, but because they were told this 1,000 times. And they believed it. And so that many brainwashed people don't say that I'm, as always, lying, we'll look at some simple statistics, as always. For example, the Tu-100-41 of the popular airplanes of the USSR. And let's Google information from official sources. A total of 205 such airplanes were produced. Of those, 37 were lost as a result of crashes or serious accidents. That means almost every fifth airplane crashed. And you think this is only true of the Tu-104? Not at all. You could say that about almost any airplane in the USSR. An-24T. In total, 1,367 An-24s were produced. However, since 2000, they have been manufactured in China, and some of the planes are already Chinese. 174 planes have been lost. That's far from absolute reliability, right? The original version of the An-24 was a typical passenger plane. It was quite rugged, allowing landings on small, unprepared airfields and dirt strips. However, the T model was modified. It was equipped to meet the needs of military aviation. Instead of a passenger plane, it became a transport aircraft. The An-24T was designed for transporting cargo, soldiers, or paratroopers. It was also used for transporting the wounded. The aircraft that led to the tragedy in Svetlogorsk was assigned to the Baltic Fleet Air Force. The location and circumstances of the case. For the sake of fairness, I want to specifically emphasize that technical issues were not to blame in all Soviet air disasters. Sometimes bad weather conditions played a fatal role, but much more often it was the notorious human factor. Carelessness, incompetence, or simply the pilots being drunk could cost the lives of dozens or even hundreds of innocent people. The An-24T plane we are interested in was practically new. 3 years before the events in question, in 1969, it rolled off the assembly line at the Irkutsk aviation plant and had never been repaired. Its crew consisted of 6 people, led by the commander, Captain Vilor Gudnikov. Almost nothing is known about him from open sources, just a regular pilot. Except that local residents, after the crash, claimed that he supposedly had a weakness for hard liquor. In general, a tendency toward alcoholism during service was common among many Soviet officers, especially in small towns or provincial garrisons. In places where there was nothing much to do, where Soviet dullness, boredom, and hopelessness thrived, the valiant defenders of the motherland systematically indulged in widespread drinking. Those viewers who had a chance to serve in the ranks of the Soviet army can specifically write about this phenomenon in the comments. But what was considered forgivable in the infantry or even in the tank troops was completely unacceptable for military aviation. Soon you'll understand why. And now a few words about the place of the tragedy. The city of Svetlogorsk is located in the Kaliningrad region, the very one that is separated from the main part of Russia. The very one that is surrounded by Poland, Lithuania, and the Baltic Sea. For those who don't know history well, let me remind you that the Kaliningrad region is originally German land, East Prussia, and its administrative capital, Kaliningrad, was not long ago called Königsberg, which in German means Royal Mountain. Only after World War II did Stalin make the German land Russian, while at the same time deporting almost all of the local population from there. So the Soviets forcibly deported not only the Kalmyks, Chechens, Ingush and Crimean Tatars, but also the Germans. However, that's a topic for a separate video. The tragedy over Svetlogorsk. On May 16, 1972 at 12:15, an An-24T aircraft with the tail number 05 took off from Krabrovo airfield near Kaliningrad. At that moment, in addition to the 6 crew members, there were also 2 passengers on the plane, who were inspectors of radio engineering equipment. In fact, the very purpose of this flight was to check the operation of the coastal surveillance system, a fairly simple task that did not require much effort. That day, there was a thick fog over the coast of the Baltic Sea. The controllers also noticed another oddity. Instead of the prescribed 500 meters altitude, the plane was flying at an altitude of 100 to 150 meters, which was extremely dangerous even by Soviet safety standards. After making a turn over the sea, the plane crossed the coastline near Zelenogradsk and set course for Cape Taran. And soon after that, the mark of aircraft 05 disappeared from the radar screens. As it turned out, at about 12:30, the plane entered thick fog over Svetlogorsk at an unacceptably low altitude, only 42 meters. As a result, it clipped the tops of pine trees with its wing and lost part of the wing. Then it flew another 200 meters or so, hit a Ferris wheel, flipped over, and crashed into a kindergarten building located on Lenin Street. When it collided with the kindergarten building, the second floor was completely destroyed. Then there was a massive aviation fuel leak, and as a result, a very strong fire broke out. At the time of the crash, there were 29 people in the building. Unfortunately, 20 minutes before the disaster, the children had just returned from a walk and were sitting down to have lunch. The results were truly horrifying. In addition to the 8 people who were on board the An-24 T-24 children from the kindergarten, aged 2 to 7 also died, as well as 3 kindergarten staff members, the cook Tamara Yankovskaya and the teachers Valentina Shabashova-Metelitsa and Antonina Romanenko. In total, there were 35 victims. Of all those who were in the kindergarten, only 2 survived, though they suffered terrible burns. 2 10th grade girls were also injured, Tanya Yezhova and Natasha Tsigankova, who were walking near the kindergarten. They were engulfed by the fumes of aviation fuel from the falling plane. The girls were instantly set on fire, suffered multiple burns, but managed to survive. What happened next? Within minutes after the explosion, police units, firefighters, soldiers from nearby military units, sailors from the Baltic Fleet, and of course KGB agents arrived at the crash site. Well, how could they not be? A triple cordon was set up instantly. Armed soldiers, tightly locking arms, could barely hold back the desperate mothers who were trying to get to where their children had died in the terrible fire. What happened next defies all bounds of humanity. To cover up the tragedy in Svetlogorsk, a state of emergency was declared. Residents were forbidden not only to leave the city, but even to step outside their homes. Electricity and telephones were cut off. All exits from the city were blocked. Svetlogorsk stood still. People sat in dark apartments as if in shelters during wartime. Since the evening, police and civilian patrols were on duty along the coast. The work of clearing the debris and searching for the bodies of the dead continued late into the night. The remains of the ruins, as it would later turn out, were taken to a dump on the outskirts of the city. For a long time afterward, charred children's books and toys, as well as parts and items of military equipment, would still be found in its surroundings. As soon as the last loaded truck left the city limits, the place where the kindergarten had stood just the day before was leveled, and the scorched earth was covered with turf. To hide the traces of the tragedy from outsiders, it was decided to create a small park on that spot, as local resident Andrei Dmitriev recalled. By morning, it was as if the kindergarten had never existed. In its place, a flower bed bloomed. Many parents couldn't believe their eyes. The scorched earth was cut away. Turf was laid down. Paths sprinkled with crushed red brick, broken and charred trees were cut down, and only the sharp smell of kerosene lingered. The smell lingered for another 2 weeks. And not a single Soviet newspaper wrote about this tragedy, not to mention television. Do you understand what I mean? It's hard to explain. It might even seem like I'm about to justify the USSR, but that's not exactly the case. Of course, the USSR does bear some responsibility for the tragedy, but tragedies like this can happen in any other country as well. Even in civilized countries like the USA, Germany, or Australia. Or in dictatorial countries like the USSR and Soviet Korea, or present-day Russia. The human factor, equipment malfunction, even the weather. Unfortunately, such things happen everywhere, and no one is immune to it. But after a tragedy happens, there is a very telling reaction from the authorities. And what was in the investigation, which I'll talk about a bit later, is just insane. In the USSR, those in power always chose to lie and to hide everything. In fact, that's exactly what they do in Russia now. Yesterday there were children, and today they're gone. The whole place, along with the kindergarten, was leveled to the ground. So what? There was nothing there. That flower bed has always been there. And this isn't an isolated case. That's what they did and continue to do. Remember Chernobyl? Why did I just think of it now? Because right now, as this text is being written, there was news that an accident happened at the Rostov nuclear power plant, and the radiation level is 75 times higher than normal. That a huge amount of radiation is spreading across Russia and moving towards Saratov. And naturally, the Russian authorities say that this is all a lie. Everything is operating as normal. Maybe this news is just a rumor, but I think the accident actually happened. It's just not as large scale as some sources describe. We won't learn the truth about the nuclear power plant anytime soon. But we can study history. It always shows that the authorities of the USSR and Russia lie. It's just that this becomes known a little later. It's been proven so many times that you can't count them on your fingers and toes. I just don't understand. I really honestly don't understand how peace-loving Russians believe people who constantly lie to them. By the way, Radio Free Europe from Munich broadcast a message on the same day, just a few hours after the accident. A military transport plane, an An-26 of the Baltic Fleet Naval Aviation, crashed into a kindergarten in Svetlogorsk 3 hours ago. Among the dead are children under the age of 6 teachers and the plane's crew. In total, more than 30 people. Well, you see, Radio Free Europe is lying too. It wasn't an An-26, it was an An-24T, so it's not all that clear-cut. Who is to blame for the tragedy? So what was the reason for the crash of a new and seemingly perfectly functional plane? There is still no answer to this day, since a criminal case regarding the disaster was never even opened. There was only an internal investigation, which was carried out by a special commission from Moscow, headed by Colonel General Nikolai Alexeyev. The members of the commission questioned everyone who was involved with the flight. They decoded the data from the black boxes and apparently came to some sort of conclusion. But it was never made public, and they limited themselves to a very vague and even somewhat absurd statement. Unsatisfactory preparation and management of the flight. The official investigation materials have still not been officially published or made public. Unfortunately, this case is still classified. What do you think is the reason? Write in the comments. It was only later revealed that alcohol was found in the pilot's blood. And you do understand that they really could have been drunk. Or maybe it's all different, and someone decided to blame everything on the pilots. That's the whole catch. You can't hear the real truth in the Russian Federation. The parents were given marked coffins and forbidden to open them. The deceased children and teachers were buried in a mass grave at the local cemetery, not far from the Svetlogorsk 1 railway station. Taking photographs of the funeral ceremony was strictly forbidden. For those who dared to break the ban, the KGB officers present would expose their film. But the victims' relatives still managed to take a few photos. Moreover, to minimize publicity on the day of the victims' funerals, commuter trains were cancelled and highways connecting the regional center with Svetlogorsk were blocked. However, even these restrictions did not prevent about 10,000 people from gathering at the cemetery, almost the entire population of the city. The pilots were laid to rest at the city cemetery in Kaliningrad, except for one, whose body was taken to his homeland by his wife. As local relatives say, the families of the deceased children were strongly opposed to having the military, whom they considered responsible, buried next to them. Already in the post-Soviet era, in 1994, a memorial chapel was erected at the site of the disaster. Every year, on May 16th, relatives of the victims or simply concerned citizens come here. The third crime. How the Soviet authorities drove people to starvation and then executed them for it. Novocherkassk, the massacre. Today I'm going to tell you a classic story about life in the USSR. The authorities exploit people, push them to the brink of starvation, and make wrong decisions, and when people voiced their disagreement, they were shot. Then, following the classic scenario, the incident is covered up. Some other people are shot again. And those truly responsible for the crime get off with a severe reprimand. Well, and after 30 years already in Russia, they admit that it was a crime, but we can't punish the guilty. They're all dead. This is one of the reasons why tons of archives are still being hidden by Russia. Today you'll learn how the USSR drove the ordinary workers of the city of Novocherkassk into a hopeless situation. And when they staged a protest, the valiant soldiers of the USSR used weapons. You absolutely need to know the truth as it is, how Khrushchev destroyed agriculture. Tell me, please, what do you know about Nikita Khrushchev? What's the first thing that comes to mind? That's right, Korn. More advanced viewers will also remember that Khrushchev was better than Stalin because he gave freedom to millions of Gulag prisoners. And those who were executed were posthumously rehabilitated. At the same time, they forget that under Khrushchev, dissidents were also imprisoned, and the corn genius himself, because of his hot temper, brought the planet to the brink of nuclear catastrophe several times. But today we will talk specifically about the corn saga, as well as another, less well-known project of Khrushchev, which undermined the already fragile agriculture in the USSR. And most importantly, Khrushchev actually started off pretty well. Unlike Stalin, who simply drained resources from the countryside without investing anything in it, Khrushchev initially took a number of useful measures that slightly improved both the lives of ordinary collective farmers and the state of the collective farm system as a whole. For the first time in many decades, peasants stopped feeling like serfs and received passports. A significant portion of funds was invested in the production of new agricultural machinery, and a number of irrigation systems were built, the most important of which was the North Crimean Canal. Today, due to the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant dam, this creation of the Khrushchev era is now overgrown with human-height weeds. And that's what the much-praised Russian management looks like. But all these generally progressive initiatives were undone by Khrushchev's obsessive and completely unfounded desire to plant all the fields with the wonder crop, corn. I won't even dwell on the fact that the USSR traditionally specialized in growing other grains, wheat, barley, and rye. And such a heat-loving plant as corn could only be cultivated in the southern regions. However, of course, in the totalitarian Soviet system, no one paid attention to such trifles. If the party said it was necessary, then everyone from young to old obeyed, and as soon as the snow melted, they started planting corn all over the place. The result of such an experiment turned out to be extremely disastrous. They didn't sow wheat, and they didn't harvest corn. There were a whole series of jokes among the people about how, in regions with harsh climates, like the Arkhangelsk region, corn grew no taller than 50 centimeters over the summer. And people were afraid to report to Khrushchev for a long time about the failure of his brilliant idea. The country was saved from real hunger only by massive grain purchases abroad, from the damn capitalists in the US and Canada. And this was despite the fact that not long ago the USSR was the main supplier of grain to the European market. But Khrushchev is not only famous for the corn campaign. The Kremlin leader's new concern was providing the Soviet people with meat and dairy products. And for this, he announced that in 3 years it was necessary to catch up with and surpass America in the production of meat, milk, and butter per capita. This goal of catching up and surpassing finally ruined agriculture. After all, instead of investing in animal feed, expanding pastures, introducing material incentives for collective farm workers, and implementing new equipment at meat processing plants and dairies, the focus was placed specifically on fulfilling the plans handed down from Moscow, which were completely detached from reality. As a result, hundreds of thousands of heads of livestock were slaughtered. Official reports were falsified, America was never caught up with, and millions of citizens were left without meat, butter, and milk. As they say, if God wants to punish a person, he takes away their reason. The party cares about its people. All these experiments, multiplied by the inefficiency of the Soviet planned economy and various reckless plans of Khrushchev, led to a deep food crisis in the USSR in the early 1960s. It wasn't a full-scale famine yet, but the shortage of food and its low quality were felt throughout the country, except perhaps for the Kremlin canteens and restaurants intended for foreign delegations. There was an acute shortage of bread, grains, vegetable oil, meat, milk, and other basic food products in the country. In 1962, for the first time since the abolition of the wartime ration card system, a practice was introduced in cities where bread was sold in stores with a limit per person. And moreover, all cafeterias were switched to an austerity mode. Soon, mass raids began to monitor the proper slicing of bread. For those who don't remember the generous and prosperous times of the USSR, let me remind you that in Soviet cafeterias, bread, along with salt and black pepper, was simply placed on the tables. Formerly it was free, although of course its cost was included in the price of other dishes. That is, in the cafeteria, you could buy something simple and fill up just by eating bread with tea or water, taking bread from the tables where no one limited it. Now this practice has been discontinued. Bread started being served only together with meals you ordered, or you had to pay for it separately at the cashier in the self-service cafeteria. Moreover, flour began to disappear from stores. There were problems with the supply of white bread, even in Moscow, Leningrad, and the capitals of the Union republics. And in many regions it simply disappeared from sale. Only black bread was delivered. Or they baked ersatz bread, adding anything possible to the rye flour. Oat bran, grated pea or barley groats, millet grains, sunflower seeds. As people who lived in those times said, a loaf of bread was so hard and tough that you could even kill a person with it. They don't specify what such a miracle bread tasted like. But if they somehow managed to deal with the bread situation, things were much worse with meat and milk. After all, you can't replace them with a substitute. And that's why the People's Soviet government decided to help the common people, by raising food prices. If the cost is higher, there will be fewer people wanting to buy them. And the shortage will disappear on its own, as if nothing ever happened. On June 1, 1962, all central newspapers published a decree from the Central Committee of the CPSU and the Council of Ministers of the USSR about raising prices for meat and dairy products. Retail prices for meat and meat products, especially sausages, increased on average by 31% and for butter by 25 to 35%. At the same time, the authorities showed maximum cynicism by mentioning that this price increase was supposedly the request of all working people. In Soviet times, all issues were decided by the working people in the warm Kremlin offices. Initial unrest. This decision became the spark that ignited public discontent. In Moscow, Leningrad, Kyiv, Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk and other cities, leaflets calling for the overthrow of the anti-people Soviet government appeared instantly. However, unlike in Novocherkassk, this outrage mainly resulted in writing various offensive anti-Soviet phrases on fences and the walls of public restrooms. In Novocherkassk, the situation took a different turn. To begin with, a few words about Novocherkassk itself. It was a fairly large city with a population of 100,000 people located in the south of Russia, near Rostov-on-Don. It was known for being considered the capital of the Don Cossacks for centuries. However, at one time, the Soviet authorities destroyed the Cossacks as a socially alien element. But still, as later events would show, the rebellious spirit there did not completely disappear. Among the numerous enterprises of the city, the Novocherkassk electric locomotive plant, named after Budyonny, stood out, where about 12,000 people worked. Among the local workers, it had a very poor reputation due to extremely harsh working conditions. The equipment was extremely outdated. Since the plant was established in 1932, modernization had never been carried out, so manual physical labor was widely used. The living conditions were extremely poor. There weren't enough factory dormitories for everyone, construction of houses was too slow, and people had to rent apartments. The rent for housing took up 20 to 30% of the workers' salaries. Many people crowded into dilapidated barracks without basic amenities. It's no surprise that under such conditions, staff turnover became the norm. They hired even those who couldn't get a job anywhere else, including criminals who had just been released from prison. Before the price increases, there was already unrest at the factory, mostly over day-to-day issues. About 3 months before the events took place, the workers in the assembly shop's body section refused to start work, demanding better working conditions. And in the winding and insulation shop, due to low safety standards, about 200 people were poisoned. Almost at the same time, the pay rates for strenuous work were reduced by 10%, which automatically led to a decrease in wages, and the production quota for workers was increased by about a third. So work more and get paid less. That's how it was. That was the communist future. 3 bloody days. From the very morning of June 1, 1962, the whole factory was in an uproar. Unlike modern people whose day starts with a smartphone, back then a worker's day started with reading the newspaper. And of course, they were deeply outraged by the price increase. The molders of the steel foundry didn't start work at all, and basically organized a spontaneous protest. Very quickly, colleagues from other workshops joined them. They stopped working and demanded higher pay rates for their labor. The protesters, numbering about 1,000 people, moved toward the plant management office. You know, they say that a person can be healed with a word or struck down instantly. This folk wisdom is the perfect way to describe the events that followed. For example, there's a theory that the French Revolution escalated from a simple uprising into a full revolution because of a careless phrase by Queen Marie Antoinette, who supposedly said that if people have no bread, let them eat cake. Something similar happened in Novocherkassk. Only the role of the Queen of France was played by the factory director Boris Kurochkin. He came out to the protesters, but instead of trying to understand the situation, he behaved a bit inappropriately and in the end said that if you don't have money for meat pies, eat pies with liver. According to another version, he tried to diffuse the situation a bit and said in a joking manner a little differently, "We'll eat pies together." However, what matters in history is not what the person wanted to say, but how others perceived his words. And the protesting workers took the phrase about pies as a personal insult. They started booing the director and shouting insults at him. In the end, Kurochkin ran away, but the chief engineer Yolkin did not. Despite the lack of social networks, messengers, or even independent television at that time, rumors about what was happening at the Novocherkassk electric locomotive plant spread instantly throughout the city. Sympathizers from other enterprises joined the protesters, and the protests themselves spread beyond the plant. Within a few hours, the crowd grew to 4,000 people. The strikers blocked the railway main line, stopping the Saratov-Rostov passenger train. Someone wrote on the stopped locomotive, "Turn Khrushchev into sausage." I want to note that at this stage of the conflict, bloodshed could still have been avoided if the authorities had at least partially looked at the problem from the perspective of ordinary people. But upon learning about the unrest in Novocherkassk, Khrushchev gave an unconditional order to suppress the anti-Soviet riot by all possible means and in the shortest possible time. Troops started deploying to the city. However, at first, the city authorities arrived at the factory to try one last time to calm the enraged crowd. But no one was listening anymore to the speech of the first secretary of the Rostov Regional Committee, Alexander Basov. He was pelted with stones, metal parts, and bottles. Only a police unit saved the official from being lynched. The police also tried to deal with the protesters before the troops were brought into the city, but they failed. The dissatisfied workers gained the upper hand, knocking down several employees. On the night of June 2nd, tanks and soldiers entered Novocherkassk. They took important city facilities under guard, including the KGB building, the city police department, the state bank, the post office, the telegraph, and the radio center. By morning, a government delegation led by the USSR's second most important person, Frol Kozlov, flew in from Moscow. However, despite Khrushchev's decision to use force, the first deputy commander of the North Caucasus military district, Matvey Shaposhnikov, refused to carry out the order to disperse the demonstrators with tanks. Moreover, fearing the spontaneous use of weapons, he ordered the tank crews and motorized riflemen to unload their assault rifles and carbines, and to hand over all their ammunition to the regimental and battalion deputy commanders for technical matters. A rare act of civil courage and defiance of the system for its time. Later, this brave general and war hero paid for his bold act with his career. He was dismissed from the army and expelled from the party. Meanwhile, under red flags and portraits of Lenin, the protesters marched to the center of Novocherkassk, to the city party committee building. At first, the crowd consisted only of workers, but as they moved along, random people began to join them, including women with children. As researchers later noted, the strikers did not have a single leader or an organizational core. Most people acted on their own initiative. When the crowd approached the city party committee building, the chairman of the city executive committee, Zamula, tried to address those who had gathered from the balcony using a megaphone, urging them to stop moving forward and return to their workplaces. But sticks, stones, and other improvised objects were thrown at those standing on the balcony. After that, the strikers broke into the building and caused complete devastation. Several protesters made their way onto the balcony and began calling for the overthrow of the criminal authorities. The outcome was bloody. Soon units of the internal troops arrived at the square in armored personnel carriers. The internal troops belonged to the Ministry of Internal Affairs and did not report to General Shaposhnikov. They were the ones who opened fire on the crowd. After the first shots and the first casualties, the crowd scattered, leaving bodies on the asphalt. You heard that right. The protesters were simply shot. That means the government is doing everything to make you starve. Your labor is being exploited to the fullest. You work in unbearable conditions, and you're supposed to be grateful for it. If not, then it's a firing squad. There was no clear information about what happened. The most terrible rumors were spreading through the city about people being cut down by machine gun fire, perhaps by the hundreds, about tanks crushing the crowd. Naturally, all this did not contribute to the people's love for the Soviets, and yet the problem could have been solved at an early stage. Let off steam and not bring it to the point of shooting unarmed people. But in the USSR, concern for people always manifested itself in the form of violence and lies. In this case, it was violence they resorted to. The consequences of the Novocherkassk uprising. When by the evening of June 3rd, the protests had been suppressed and mass arrests began. The high-ranking officials who arrived from Moscow began to sum things up. It should be noted that, firstly, most of the documents about the Novocherkassk shooting are still classified as top secret. And secondly, it is not always possible to determine exactly why a particular person died. Anything could have happened in the chaos. It has only been established that, officially, 22 people died from gunshot wounds. 2 more protesters died under unclear circumstances, and at least 70 people were injured with varying degrees of severity. Although some historians claim that no fewer than 50 people were killed. Naturally, knowing the official data of the USSR, I understand that this is a lie, because the official figures are always, absolutely always, false. And it's always somehow in favor of the Soviet authorities. I wonder why that is? By the way, it still hasn't been determined who exactly fired the first shot. There is a well-founded theory that, in fact, it wasn't the soldiers who started the shooting, but employees of the 9th Directorate of the KGB in civilian clothes, who were responsible for the security of high-ranking party and government officials. As an argument, it's pointed out that if the protesters had been shot at with Kalashnikov rifles, the wounds would have been different, and there would have been significantly more bodies. Overall, the Novocherkassk massacre, although information about it was classified for almost 30 years, led to far-reaching consequences. This bloodbath, combined with other failed ventures and economic problems, greatly undermined Khrushchev's authority among the other Kremlin leaders. Many in the CPSU Central Committee thought a less harsh approach was needed, avoiding weapons. The leader of the USSR was rapidly losing the party elite's trust. And the result of such discontent is well known to all of you, the palace coup of 1964, when Khrushchev was replaced by the more balanced Leonid Brezhnev. Who was to blame and what should have been done? 2 months after the Novocherkassk massacre, a closed trial was held for 110 detainees. Thanks to KGB agents who secretly took photographs of the protesters, the most active participants in the unrest were identified. They were charged with banditry, mass riots, and attempting to overthrow Soviet power. 7 people were sentenced to death and executed by firing squad. The rest received prison sentences ranging from 2 to 15 years to be served in strict regime penal colonies. All of them were only rehabilitated in 1996, most of them posthumously. The good name of General Shaposhnikov was also restored, whom Khrushchev once branded as a cowardly weakling. Some of the local officials were subjected to sham punishments. The author of the explosive phrase about pies, Director Korochkin, was expelled from the party and removed from his position as director. Also, a number of local officials received a severe reprimand, which was recorded in their personal files. And yet, everything could have turned out differently if the world's most pro-people government had been at least a little closer to its people and didn't look at the needs of ordinary people only from the window of their personal car. As many participants later admitted, the discontent would not have grown to such proportions and would not have led to such radical actions if they had simply been spoken to properly from the very beginning. So it would have been quite possible to prevent the Novocherkassk tragedy and avoid the loss of human lives. However, human life has never been valued either in Soviet Russia or in modern Putin's Russia. We must remember this well. Crime number 4, the Kurenivka tragedy, how the Soviet authorities flooded Kyiv, causing many casualties. Remember how the Soviet authorities concealed the scale of the Chernobyl disaster? I think everyone knows about that. But today, I'm going to surprise you, especially those who live in Kyiv. It turns out that back in 1961, there was another terrible tragedy that the Soviet authorities kept hidden from everyone. Huge torrents of water with a high content of sand and clay flooded Kyiv, killing hundreds of people. Even now, it's very difficult to find official information about the tragedy. It's hard to believe, but at that time neither the press nor the radio nor television reported what had happened. The tragedy was classified as secret. That day, long distance and international communication was cut off in Kyiv so that no one could say anything. The official announcement about the disaster was broadcast on the radio only on March 16, 3 days after the flood. Not only information about the tragedy itself was censored. To prevent widespread publicity, the Soviet authorities ordered the victims to be buried in different cemeteries and to list different dates and causes of death in the documents. But today, as always, I will reveal this secret information to you. We'll even dig into the secret KGB documents from that time, so that the whole world knows the truth, the real reasons behind the tragedy. After the end of World War II in 1945, Kyiv needed large-scale reconstruction. There were a lot of destroyed buildings, and to rebuild the city, construction materials were desperately needed. At that time, clay bricks were mainly used. On the outskirts of Kyiv, there were 2 Petrovsky brick factories operating at that time. During the production of bricks, a large amount of waste was generated, which had to be disposed of somewhere. Naturally, in the USSR, they didn't want to spend money to solve the waste problem in a civilized way. They found another way. You won't believe it. They simply decided to dump the waste into Babyn Yar. Yes, you understood everything correctly. That very place. Babyn Yar is a ravine in the northwestern part of Kyiv, which became known for the mass execution of civilians by the German occupiers. It's hard to believe, but between 100,000 and 150,000 people were executed there. They mainly executed Jews, Roma, prisoners of war, and Ukrainians. This is a terrible story. But today we're not talking about that, we're talking about the area. In any normal country, this would be a place of remembrance and mourning, so that no one would ever forget these events. But in the USSR, they decided otherwise. They needed this land for waste. And that's exactly what they used it for. Here's what the outstanding Ukrainian architect Anatoly Ignaschenko, who created the Babyn Yar Memorial, said. I quote, "According to the ideology that prevailed here at the time, none of the victims of Babyn Yar deserved to be remembered by the people. Ukrainians were nationalists. Prisoners of war were vile cowards and traitors. As for the Jews, there was a common opinion. What kind of nation is this, if, without resisting the fascists, they came to Babyn Yar to be shot at the occupier's first call, like a flock of sheep? So let's go back to the 1950s. Brick factories were dumping leftover sand, dirt and soil into Babyn Yar. The scale of construction was large. Accordingly, there was a lot of waste, the so-called slurry. Therefore, in order for the slurry to remain in natural settling ponds, they began to build dams. The project development was assigned not to the Kyiv design organization, which clearly could have studied the soil better on site, as they say, but to a Moscow-based hydro-engineering office. In 10 years starting from 1952, they managed to build 4 dams. By the way, the last of them, just a month before the flood, weren't even provided with drainage. The countdown to the tragedy started to accelerate. In the last days, the Soviet authorities knew that something irreversible was about to happen. After all, the fact that the dam walls were being eroded by small streams and that their number was steadily increasing was reported to the then mayor of Kyiv, Oleksiy Davidov. Officials hoped, so to speak, it wouldn't happen while they were in office. Everyone who said that there would be a breach here was thrown out of the offices, threatened with arrest, and only given standard phrases like, "The situation is under control, there's no need to panic." Now we're going to look at some very interesting things. Let's read excerpts from KGB reports that have already been now declassified. First, a graduate student at the Institute of Art Studies of the Academy of Sciences of the Ukrainian SSR, Matvienko, reported at the institute that as early as last year he saw water seeping through the dam and specifically went to the construction organization, where he warned them about the possible consequences. However, he was allegedly told that his report did not deserve serious attention. Second, among the students and faculty of the state, there are active discussions among the students and faculty of the state university during which it is claimed that water began seeping through the dam a few days before March 13, and this was a sign of the impending disaster. But no one paid attention, and no measures were taken. Third, some local residents claim that the artesian well specialist Schrader, who works as the head of the water and sewage department, objected to the dumping of soil in Babi Yar. However, his comments were ignored, and the work was carried out at the insistence of the chief construction engineer until the disaster. And now it gets even more interesting. There are documents showing that on the day before the accident, the dumping was carried out not for the usual 8 hours, but for 16 hours. Such a procedure was adopted. The first dumping scheme, 8 hours of dumping, 8 hours of settling, and another 8 hours for pumping out the discharged water. But on March 12, the dumping went on for 2 shifts, continuously. The water level rose, and it started looking for a way out. And it found the weakest spot, where Dam 4 connects to the shore. What guided them, we can only guess. Because the slurry flow was hitting toward the dams, which clearly contradicted the plan. It was obvious they really wanted to meet another quota. But, as they say, you can't get into the heads of the people who gave such an order. And about their intentions and what drove them, we will never know. The notorious negligence, carelessness, and the desire to fulfill the plan instead of ensuring safety are just a small part of the reasons that led to the deaths of hundreds of people. At 9:20 in the morning on March 13, 1961, the 4th and highest dam burst. And then, almost immediately after that, 3 more dams were destroyed. A wall of slurry, a full 14 meters high, rushed down the slope, sweeping away everything in its path. It was a real nightmare. A power line fell onto a blocked bus full of passengers, and it exploded. The slurry was moving at a speed of 5 meters per second, and nothing could stop it. Those who survived said it was terrible. At the bottom of the descent in Kurenivka, there was a tram depot. It took much of the impact. A tram car was swept away by the wave. The gas distribution station exploded, and the cars blocked below ended up under 3 meters of mud. It was a real disaster, and they were forced to keep quiet about it. We will talk about this later today. By the way, after the tragedy itself, among Jewish people who were near the site of the disaster, there were comments that the dead could not endure it, and that a monument to the Jews who died should have been built at Babi Yar, not just filling in the ravine. One of the city residents, who was in the crowd, said, "The memory of those who died at Babi Yar should not have been desecrated. That's why such a thing happened. But we deal with facts. 1. Improper disposal of industrial waste. 2. The project was created by engineers who didn't know the area. 3. Blatant violation of construction standards. 4. Violation of work procedures, overloading of the dam system. 5. Ignoring reports from residents about violations. Chronology of events according to local residents. I suggest that instead of dry reports from the Commission's investigation, we look at excerpts from letters that Kyiv residents wrote to their relatives and loved ones, trying to convey at least part of the truth. By the way, the texts of these letters are available to us today, not thanks to the recipients who kept them, but thanks to the painstaking work of the security services, which carried out so-called mail censorship and filed reports on it. As you can easily guess, these letters were never sent. Next is a quote from a report by KGB head Nikitchenko to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine on the mood of Kyiv residents. An unknown author, in his letter addressed to Shmachenko, who lives in the city of Sumy, writes, "Dear ones, I'm writing to tell you the news. Podil and Kurenivka are completely flooded. At 10 o'clock in the morning, some large underground lake burst. The water is sweeping away 3-story buildings, overturning all the trams and buses that were passing through there at that time. People are being airlifted from rooftops by helicopters. The hospitals are completely full. All the police and military units are there, but they can't do anything. There was a woman riding the bus to work, and suddenly, as the water rushed toward them, the bus overturned, and the gas tank inside broke and exploded. Inside the bus, it's a complete mess. People can't get out of the vehicle, water is pouring in from above, and gasoline has spilled on the water and is burning. There's panic here now, since the water keeps rising and nothing can be done. Houses are being undermined, collapsing, they're sliding away and so on. They say there are a lot of casualties." In a letter from an unknown author addressed to Nikolenkova, who lives in the Chelyabinsk region, it says, "Today in Kyiv at 8:30 in the morning we had a major emergency. In one part of the city, a dam that held back a large reservoir on a hill burst. The dam was an earth-filled dam. The wave of water, mixed with mud and silt, reached heights of up to 8 meters. This wave destroyed even multi-story buildings and uprooted trees in its path. Several tramcars and trolleybuses were flooded with water and mud mixed with silt, and all of them were filled with people, mostly on their way to work. Several hospitals, the tram depot, and the stadium were also flooded and inundated. Many small factories ended up under water and mud. Along with the people who had started work at 8 in the morning, the flooded area is cordoned off by the military. Many teams are working to rescue people and valuables. It is said that thousands of people have fallen victim to this unprecedented disaster." Citizen Shamlia sent a letter to the Nikolaev region in which he writes, "Today we have such a misfortune that I don't even know where to begin. Somewhere near Kyiv there was a gas explosion and there was a lake nearby. The lake burst and everything flooded Kurenivka and Secrecy. The area that was taken over by the water was swept away and there was no trace left. Everything was covered with silt. The stadium, the tram depot and the hospital were flooded. All the private houses were destroyed. There were many casualties. The trams are burning because of electrical short circuits. Not a single car, not a single bus, not a single tram, not a single pedestrian, no one made it out of that area. They say you can see the roof of a bus sticking out from under the ground. No one is allowed near, the area is cordoned off, people are frantic." Of course, many people weren't direct witnesses to the events. They relied on second-hand accounts, but it still clearly shows how terrible it was. And because the authorities didn't inform people about the causes and consequences of what happened, rumors started spreading about a gas explosion and even about a hydrogen bomb going off. By the way, the same Nikitchenko and other employees from the 3-letter agency complain in some of their other reports, and I quote, "Signals continue to come in about the spread of various rumors and exaggerations among the city's population in connection with the accident. The KGB believes that this is happening because the city's residents are not informed about what happened in Podol. In this regard, it might be advisable for the city committee, district party committees, and party organizations of enterprises, institutions, and educational establishments to conduct explanatory работу среди населения города Киева. Of course, not to explain in order to reveal the whole truth and dispel various rumors, but to silence everyone who spreads information and calls the city leadership to account. Consequences. According to the official version of the investigation commission, which was announced in the newspaper Evening Kyiv on March 31, 1961, there were 145 fatalities. 143 people are considered victims and are undergoing treatment in the city's hospitals. After the collapse of the USSR and the opening of the archives, historians were not able to find any new shocking figures in the reports. However, according to various sources, the most realistic range for the number of victims is 350 to 450 people. The bodies of the dead were pulled out over the course of a month. According to forensic experts, some people remained alive under layers of soil for up to 10 days. The bodies were kept in different cemeteries in Kyiv, and holding memorial services or commemorating the dead was forbidden. The cleanup operations lasted for more than a month, working in 2 shifts. They used bulldozers and excavators for clearing, as well as several hundred trucks to transport the solidified pulp to other areas. In addition to civilians, the army was also involved in these operations. The opinion of Western radio stations that broadcast their programs in 1961, having studied about 2,000 deaths, for example, Voice of America, compared the tragedy in Kurenivka to Pompeii. The Pompeii of the 20th century label, as well as the research of historians from the early 21st century who write about 1,500 victims, currently have no documentary basis. However, this in no way diminishes the guilt of the designers, the workers of various executive committees, or the entire hierarchy of the totalitarian regime. A regime whose defining feature was the primary desire to silence and hide the truth. Concealing the incident. Why was this disaster hushed up, with only a dry statement of facts in one article that came out almost 3 weeks after the day of the tragedy? And even there, they wrote not so much about the scale of what happened, but rather proudly reported on the restoration of transportation and the allocation of new housing to the residents who suffered. By the way, at that time, it was standard to have 8.9 square meters per person. Who do you think they made the main culprit? I bet you 100 to 1 you won't guess. Any opinion right now? Just say it. 1, 2, 3. The wind. And that's despite the fact that according to the weather report on the morning of March 13th, the wind was typical for early spring. 79 meters per second. The final commission report stated a ludicrous 20 meters per second. The highest degree of cynicism. So that information about the emergency wouldn't spread around the city, let alone outside it. In Kyiv, as I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, long-distance communication was completely cut off for several days. In an age without cell phones or the internet, it was, of course, much easier to keep terrible news from spreading. And keep in mind the enormous staff of KGB agents who paid special attention to preventing information about the disaster from leaking abroad, especially through foreigners. Another possible reason why everything about that ill-fated day was kept secret could have been the preparations for the first successful manned space launch. And of course, when the chance to go down in world history as the first country to launch a human into space was at stake and every day counted. They clearly didn't want to ruin their reputation, which had been so carefully built up by numerous propaganda efforts. Logically, in the eyes of the Soviet leadership, it was easier to keep these events and their consequences strictly secret, and to silence anyone who tried to make them public with threats of repression for many years. Commemoration of the victims. At the end of 1961, a new dam was finally built, 25 meters high and 175 meters long, and nearby, a network of drains was constructed to divert underground water. And the accident was forgotten for many years, or rather, people were made to forget. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fact of the tragedy was made public, and the question of commemorating those who died that day was rightfully raised. A memorial sign for the victims of the tragedy in Kurenivka was placed in Babin Yar, which unfortunately was vandalized, and the copper bell between the steles was simply broken off. Later, not far from there, right at the site of the breach of that ill-fated fourth dam, an installation in the form of a column was erected, with bricks as its foundation. This is where people should be brought on tours, so that we don't forget the main thing, that human life is more important and valuable than anything else. Most importantly, so they know the truth no matter how bitter. By the way, dear Kyivans, be sure to write what you know about this tragedy and whether you knew about it at all. I'm interested in your opinion, and by the way, suggest any topics in the comments. By the way, you can also support the channel financially on Patreon or by direct transfer to PayPal. Huge thanks to all the channel sponsors. Those are the crimes you got in exchange for ice cream. And a rhetorical question for you. Does it still taste good to you? Goodbye, everyone.